Hey everyone, how's your day going? Whether it's been good or rough, you're not alone. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the world of mystery together. I never put much stock in ghost stories, curses, or legends about haunted land. But after what happened to my family, I don't just believe I know. We had just moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of upstate New York, hoping for a quiet life away from the city. The house was charming in that rustic way, with its wraparound porch, creaky wood floors, and a view of endless fields. It came with 10 acres of land, most of it wild and overgrown. At first, we loved it. My wife, Sarah, took up gardening, and our two boys, Ethan, 10, and Lucas, 7, spent their afternoons playing in the fields. But something about the property felt off. It was subtle at first, like the air was too still, the silence too thick. At night, I'd wake up convinced someone was watching from outside our bedroom window, but when I looked, nothing was there. Then the nightmares started. Ethan was the first to experience them. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, trembling, unable to speak at first. When he finally did, the things he described sent chills down my spine. He saw bodies beneath the ground. Not just buried corpses, but twisted, mutilated figures, their mouths stretched open in silent agony. People impaled on jagged wooden stakes, their hands reaching upward as if clawing for escape. He said there were things down there with them, moving in the darkness, watching him. I told him it was just a dream. But then Lucas started having them too. And then I did. One evening, I was working late in the barn when I heard something. A soft scraping sound, like fingers dragging through loose soil. I stood still, holding my breath. The sound was coming from beneath me. I grabbed a shovel and started digging at the dirt floor. It wasn't long before I hit something solid. A trapdoor buried under just a few inches of loose earth. My pulse pounded in my ears as I pried it open. A wave of rot and decay hit me, so strong I gagged. My flashlight beam revealed a hole leading straight down, deeper than I could see. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, damp with moisture. A makeshift ladder led into the abyss. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I climbed down. The stench grew worse as I descended. The air was thick, damp, alive. My flashlight flickered. Then I saw them. Bones? Dozens of them. Some were ancient, brittle, but others, some still had flesh. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That's when I heard the whispering. Not just one voice. Many. Layered together, echoing off the stone walls. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound alone was enough to make my stomach churn. Then something moved in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I froze, my heart hammering. A hand, skeletal, gray, and clawed, slid into the light, gripping the bricks just inches from my boot. Then another. And another. I bolted. I scrambled up the ladder as fast as I could, my hands slipping on the damp rungs. The whispering turned to screams. Something was coming up after me. I barely made it to the top before I slammed the trapdoor shut and threw my weight on it. The wood shook beneath me, something pounding against it from the other side. I grabbed a heavy toolbox and shoved it on top before running back to the house. I told Sarah to grab the kids. We were leaving. I didn't care about the house, the land, any of it. We needed to go. As we loaded into the car, Ethan gasped. "The ground," he whispered. I turned and felt my stomach drop. The land around the barn was moving. The dirt buckled and cracked as if something beneath was breathing. More holes appeared, yawning wide, like gaping mouths in the earth. We peeled out of there so fast I barely remembered shutting the car door. We never went back. A year later, curiosity got the best of me. I searched online for records of the land's history. What I found still haunts me. The property once belonged to a farming settlement in the early 1900s. Over the span of 20 years, entire families vanished without a trace. Some believed they'd been murdered, their bodies hidden somewhere on the land. But no remains were ever found. The town went silent and the land was sold off. Then I found a police report from 1989. Local farmer disappears after reporting strange holes on his land. House found abandoned. No sign of the owner. I sometimes wonder if we had stayed one more night, would we have disappeared too? And sometimes when the wind howls late at night, I swear I can still hear it. The sound of something digging. Some stories never get an explanation. My mother tried for years to make sense of what happened that day. But no matter how many times she replayed it in her mind, it always ended the same way, with a terrifying, impossible question. How did I end up under that bed? It was the summer of 1985. I was just a few months old when my mother took me and my older siblings, Emily, Daniel, and Mark back to her hometown in rural Mississippi to visit my grandparents. My father was stationed overseas with the army, so we stayed for a few weeks in my grandparents' old house, a creaky, two-story farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. The house sat on acres of open land, surrounded by ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, where the floors groaned under every footstep, and where the walls seemed to hold echoes of conversations long past. My mother had grown up in that house, and despite its age, it had always felt like home to her. But there were stories she never paid much attention to when she was younger, stories she never truly believed, until the day I disappeared. It was a hot and sticky afternoon. My mother had spent most of the morning wrangling my older siblings, who had a seemingly endless supply of energy. When I finally drifted off to sleep in the bedroom, she lay down beside me, exhausted, letting her eyes close for just a moment. She never intended to sleep, but somehow she did. When she woke up, I was gone. At first, she thought one of my siblings had taken me to play, so she hurried out of the room, calling my name. But the house was quiet, too quiet. She found Emily and the boys still asleep in the living room, untouched. My grandparents were in the kitchen preparing lunch. None of them had seen me. Panic set in. She ran back to the bedroom, searching under blankets, in the crib, behind furniture. I was nowhere. Her breath quickened. She tore through the house, checking every possible place a baby could be. The bathroom, the pantry, the front porch. Nothing. Then, just as fear began clawing at the edges of her mind, she heard it. The faint, muffled cry. She froze, listening. It was close, so close, but she couldn't see me. Then something made her drop to her knees. A feeling, an instinct. Her hands shook as she lifted the dust ruffle of the old wooden bed. And there I was, lying on my back on the cold wooden floor, still wrapped perfectly in my blanket. Just as she had left me, she pulled me out from under the bed, clutching me to her chest, checking me for bruises or scratches. But I wasn't hurt, just scared, my tiny face wet with tears. She sat there for a long time, rocking me, trying to understand. The bed was too high. I couldn't have rolled under there. Even if I had somehow fallen, I would have hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud. She would have heard me cry, but she had slept through it all. No sound, no movement, no explanation. And the blanket, I was still perfectly swaddled, wrapped tightly just as I had been when she laid me down. How could I have moved under the bed without disturbing it? My siblings swore they hadn't touched me. My grandmother, ever calm, had a strange look in her eyes but said nothing. For the rest of the day, my mother wouldn't let me out of her sight. And that night, my grandmother finally spoke. After the house had gone quiet, when the children were asleep and the crickets hummed outside, my grandmother sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea. "You remember the old stories, don't you?" she asked my mother. My mother frowned. "What stories?" My grandmother's eyes drifted toward the darkened window. "The ones about the other village." The words sent a chill through my mother's spine. "You mean the ghost stories?" she scoffed. "Come on, Mama." My grandmother didn't smile. "They're not ghosts." She set her spoon down with a soft clink. "They're just there. Always have been." My mother felt her throat tighten. "What does this have to do with?" "Sometimes they take a liking to someone," my grandmother interrupted softly. "A child, usually." My mother's fingers gripped the edge of the table. "What are you saying?" My grandmother took a slow sip of her tea. "They took her for a little while, just to play." She paused, then looked up. "And they brought her back. Years later. I don't remember that day, but my mother never forgot. She never told me about it until I was much older. Too old to believe in fairy tales, but too young to ignore the chill that ran down my spine when she spoke. I wanted to laugh it off, to say she must have been dreaming, or that one of my brothers had moved me and was too scared to admit it. But there's something else, something I've never told anyone. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes hear whispers in the night. Voices too soft to make out, but too close to be imagined. And the mirrors, sometimes when I turn too quickly, I see something, Off. A flicker of movement. A shape that shouldn't be there. A child. Small. Wrapped in a blanket. Standing just behind me. Watching. And some nights when I wake up with a start, I have the strangest feeling that I was somewhere else. That I had just been playing. And that someone had only just put me back. Some houses don't just feel haunted, they feel aware. The house my family lived in wasn't just old, it had a presence. A grand colonial estate in Savannah, Georgia, built in the early 1900s, it had 3 stories, white columns, and a sweeping veranda that wrapped around the front. It looked picture perfect, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. But something was wrong with it. Locals had stories about it. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past it at night. Tradesmen refused to stay long. No tenant ever lasted in the guest quarters. And my grandmother, who had lived there since she was a girl, would only ever say one thing about it. Respect the house and it will respect you. But I don't think it was respect. I think it was patience. It never bothered my grandmother. Never bothered my parents. But guests? They never lasted. A repairman once came to fix a leaking ceiling. He left without finishing, pale as a sheet, refusing to say why. Housekeepers would quit after a few days, mumbling about the bad feeling they got inside. Tenants who rented the guest wing left in the dead of night, abandoning furniture, deposits, sometimes even their pets. They see things, my uncle muttered once. They hear things. I never understood what he meant, until Lang moved in. Lang was the son of a family friend, a college student needing a place to stay for a few months while waiting for dorm housing. Don't do it, my aunt warned. The house won't like him. Lang just laughed. A haunted house? What's it gonna do? Flicker the lights? He moved in on a Sunday. By Monday, the house had decided it didn't want him. He woke up to whispers in the walls. By Tuesday, he heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside his door. By Wednesday, the footsteps were inside his room. By Thursday, he had stopped sleeping. And by Friday, he screamed. It was past midnight when the house erupted with the sound of furniture crashing, something heavy slamming against the walls, and Lang's raw, terrified screams. My uncle kicked open the door. Lang was in the corner, pressed against the wall, eyes locked on the closet. The bed was overturned. The lamp was shattered on the floor. The closet door hung half open. What happened? My grandmother demanded. Lang couldn't speak for nearly an hour. I was asleep, he whispered, still shaking, and I woke up because something was in the room. Not just a feeling. A presence. His blankets had been pulled off him, slowly, deliberately. He turned over, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Then the closet door creaked open. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning, he admitted. Then I saw the hand. Fingers. Long, pale, inhumanly thin, wrapping around the edge of the door. And then Lang swallowed hard. It smiled at me. Smiled, my mother echoed. There was a face, he whispered, peering through the crack, grinning, like it had been waiting for me to see it. That's when he screamed. Lang was gone the next morning. He left without taking a single thing. It didn't like him, my uncle muttered. The house never does with strangers. My grandmother said nothing, just sipped her coffee. A few months later, I overheard my uncle speaking in hushed tones. Someone else lived in that room before, didn't they? Before we owned the house? A long pause. Then finally, my grandmother spoke. Yes. What happened to them? Another pause. Then quietly, some people leave. Some never do. Years passed. I moved away, started a life of my own. Then, one night, my sister called. Are you alone? She asked. Yeah, why? She hesitated. I was at Grandma's tonight. I went to drop something off and I saw him. Saw who? Lang? A long silence. Then just above a whisper. No. The one from his closet. A chill ran down my spine. You're joking. I wish I was. She took a shaky breath. I was walking past his old room. The closet door was open. And for just a second, I swear there was someone inside. A shadow. A shape. Tall, thin, watching. I blinked, she whispered, and it was gone. You're sure? Yeah. Because when I turned to leave, I heard something. What? Her voice was barely audible. It laughed. I haven't been back since. And I never will. But some nights when I wake up suddenly, heart pounding, I get this feeling. Like something is watching me. Like something is waiting. Like the house still remembers me.